Hello, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this A Think-In on the future of work. When we first talked about hosting this with our partners in this exercise, Capita, we were framed for the same conversation, but in a completely different context, where people like me, I'm James Harding, I'm an editor and one of the co-founders of Tortoise, thought the future of work was essentially just more work, not a fundamental revolution in the way in which we serve our customers, produce what we do, operate with our colleagues. And yet, of course, of us are living through a revolution that none of us expected, but that has fundamentally changed the way in which we think about very simple things: the workplace, the workforce, the working day. And so in the course of the next hour, what we want to do is try to marry all of your lived experiences of the revolution that we're living through in terms of work with some of the big picture questions that employers and employees are facing. Should we return to offices? Should we change the way in which we work and collaborate together? What's the point of a meeting? And so I hope that you'll bring your view, your experience, your perspective on how things could and should change in the future. If this is your first Think-In, I just want to let you know that the really key thing here is to try and hear from as many people as possible. We've got some great people who spend their lives thinking about digital networks, about AI, about working culture and practices, but you've lived it and do it too, and we really want to hear from you. To do that, there's a really simple thing you can do. You'll see that there's a chat function. Just make sure, just write in what you want to say in terms of chat. I'll pick it up. My colleague, the great Chris Cook, is on the line. As he says, he's here to moderate a conversation / pick fights. I hope that we'll find room to do both of that. The spirit of a Think-In is an act of civilized disagreement. So we want to make sure that we hear from as many people. We have an hour. We have a rule at a Think-In. It's not that rigorously enforced, but there is a rule, which is no questions. We don't want to have the sense that there are these sages with all the wisdom and everyone sits on their experience and listens. We want to hear from you, and we want to know what your point of view is. So don't ask questions, tell us what you think. There's also, you'll see there's a list of participants. If you want to, you'll see you can click on that participants tab, and there's a little box there that says raise hand. And if you raise hand, a little blue hand, a little digital hand comes up, and I know that you have something to say. And just to check that you've been listening to this rather ragged instruction manual, I'm going to test you with a question before I come to our first wise owl on this subject. And the question I've got is this, and the way I want you to answer is by going to the participants, seeing that tab, that grey tab, pressing raise hand, if you agree with this statement. I agree with the statement that working from home seemed more fun and more productive 2 weeks ago than it does today. Oh, relatively few of you. Interesting. So just to let you know, only about 30 people have wavered in their enthusiasm. Maybe some of you never thought it was any fun or productive at all. I'm going to do now lower your hands, otherwise I'm going to keep coming to you. Lower your hands. Thank you. There you are. Almost everyone's lowered their hand. Thank you. I'm going to ask you one other question. Has the experience of this pandemic, has the experience of working from home made you less confident in relying on global technology solutions and international platforms? Has it made you less confident? If you agree with the statement, yes, it's made me less confident in the idea of relying on international technology solutions and platforms, raise your hand. Again. A small group, a fraction. Only fewer than 10%. I ask it because we held one of these Think-Ins with Philip Hammond, the former Chancellor, last week, and he was talking so much about the extent to which we are going to see the rise of arguments for resilience, for forms of economic nationalism. And I wonder about the extent to which that's going to touch exactly the subject we're going to talk about tonight, the tech sector, and the extent to which it will transform the way we work. I've given a rather long introduction, longer than usual, so that we can make sure that as many people as possible can get into the thinking. I think we're now raring to go. And I'm going to start, Chantal, free with you. Chantal, you're the Executive Director of People Solutions at Capita. And we actually had a really interesting time, or at least interesting for me, possibly less so for you, interesting time, trying to consider the ways in which this COVID-19 crisis was going to transform the world of work. But we started, and I wonder whether you'd help us by going through it, we started by taking your analysis of how actually employers are looking differently at employees, the difference between jobs and skills. Can you talk a little bit about that, just so we can put in context what's likely to happen, not just in the next few days, but in the months and years ahead?
Sure. So, I mean, as we all know, our lives as consumers have significantly changed thanks to the technology that we use every day, right? To book a taxi, to order food, to essentially do whatever we need done in our lives. It's more real time, it's fast, it's not face-to-face, it's based on technology, so it's remote, it's smarter, it's when we choose to do things. So organizations therefore have been thinking about, well, if this is the change that is happening in our lives as consumers, surely there's also that digital disruption is going to come into work, and we'll have to think about the work and our workforce and how we get things done differently. So again, the same concepts that we've seen in our consumer lives with regard to speed, agility, things being real time, things being decentralized and remote, etc., have been concepts that organizations have been trying to input into their day-to-day working. And so, and there's also been the view that as a result of that, a lot of jobs are going to disappear from organizations. So as organizations started to look into this, I guess they've realized two things. Number one was that actually, rather than full jobs, in most cases, tasks are changing. So they started looking at, the full job, but deconstructing it into the tasks, some of which will be automated, some of which will be done by individuals. And then what they've also found out was that when they went to that breakdown, some of it will be done by individuals within their organization. Some of it will probably be done by individuals outside their organization. So a few things then that came out of that debate. Number one was this idea of actually it's not jobs disappearing altogether, it's around deconstructing into tasks. The moment you start looking into tasks, then you start looking at a slightly different model for getting work done. So organizations started looking at not just their employees, but actually the ecosystem within which they can potentially operate and get those tasks done by different parts of that ecosystem. In some cases by borrowing some skills from outside, in some cases by buying them into that organization, in some cases by building them. So more and more, I think, therefore, we moved from the concept of job to actually tasks that necessitate some skills. So that's kind of that difference between thinking about jobs disappearing to actually shifting the thinking around skills that underline jobs is actually a huge shift. It's important for organizations with regard to really getting to the bottom of the skills people deploy and thinking about how they get those skills can be deployed differently. But that's also a very important differentiation for individuals, because as individuals, if we take our head off the job we're currently doing and think about the skills that we have, that's actually quite liberating. And it stops us worrying that much about the actual fixed job we are employed at today versus thinking about how we can deploy our skills and capabilities in the future based on evolving demands.
Chantal, thank you. I think you're right. I think it does have the capacity to be liberating, and at the same time also forces us to question what skills we really do have, and that may not be liberating, that might be intimidating. I just wanted to, before I come to Heather McGowan, who's written a very aptly titled book, The Adaptation Advantage, and given that we are all dealing at pace with the idea of adaptation, I just wanted to pick up on a point from Lucia. I don't know whether, forgive me, I don't know whether you're Lucia or Lucia, but you've made this rather nice point in the chat here, and that you're just saying that you're glad you're not broadcasting, otherwise everyone would see that I'm having a glass of wine. And rather nicely, that's not a frivolous statement. It's directly related to the working from home topic. And actually, to take a fun comment and actually to take it a little seriously, I do think it is. I do think there's a real question about the extent to which we can create a greater sense of ourselves, be more relaxed, be more present, if you like. That's not about the wine, but about the sort of tenor with which we come to these kinds of things. Are you there, Lucia? I just wanted to find out whether or not I could ask you the extent to which you are actually liking.
I apologies in advance for the sound of children bouncing on a trampoline. I'm having a cheeky glass of wine and a cigarette, and I'm really interested in the kind of the psychological change in dynamic that's required when working from home. I have worked as an independent consultant where I've done an awful lot of work from home. I'm currently in a leadership position in an organisation, and I think the thing that I struggle with most is sort of creating boundaries. He's got his anyway, he's gone. Creating there's something about how we as individuals manage that situation. It's a very human challenge, I think. That's my comment.
But I guess I tell you the only reason. But I also think we're much more we see each other much more fully in some ways. There are ways in which we understand each other and each other's lives much more fully in this context than we do when we see each other face to face in the office. I don't know whether you feel that in your working life at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, the social connection, I mean, everything is, I don't know what other people's experiences are, but certainly my experience is that everything is more difficult. There is kind of it does feel like it's more taxing to do the basic things. And so therefore, how we prioritize and communicate have become really key tenets to this. I was really interested in the first speaker's comments about kind of skill, and I wonder what the new definition of skill is in this environment, and how we adapt to that, which I realise is kind of edging on a question which isn't allowed. So I'm going to just make it a statement. That's good.
That's good. I assume it was rhetorical. I'm going to take that idea to Heather McGowan if I can. Heather, thanks so much for joining us. I know you've done a lot of thinking about this with your think tank Work to Learn, with the book The Adaptation Advantage, which I notice is kind of stuck neatly on the shelf above your top left shoulder, above your left shoulder, I should say. But do you think that we're overestimating the extent to which this experience is really going to change our working habits and cultures? Because you've thought about this for a long time, and actually you must see the extent to which these things are baked in, and the likelihood of us just reverting to long established patterns of working.
Yeah, I would certainly say so. I think that, you know, if you just stop and look, one of the things that I think is going to happen is, no, we're not going to work this way endlessly. Not everybody's going to work from home. Not everybody's going to learn online. But it's really only been 34 days since the World Health Organization declared this a global pandemic. And in that 34 days, in fact, most of this I saw in the first 2 weeks, we shifted, anybody who could, 100% work from home. We've reworked processes overnight, from supply chains to what products you produce. Leaders have established trust and psychological safety for their teams, which they needed to do long ago. Parents, whether they liked it or not, have become teachers, and often the primary teacher in the home. Faculty or people who do learning development in organizations have gone to all classes online. Many people have pivoted their entire production lines, from distilleries that now make hand sanitizer, to fashion companies that make personal protective equipment, to automotive companies that are making ventilators, to people who are pivoting their products to what does a customer need right now. Like my friend Peter Sheehan says, don't make a product, solve a problem. And my friend Donna Shea says, what are we good at and where's the need? The people who can kind of take that mindset and sort of look at this, even if this is only a few months and we know it's probably going to be much longer, the speed at which we've adapted and successfully adapted in a number of places should give us the confidence, even if the work has not required us to adapt at quite that speed in the future, that we can do it.
And I guess, Heather, we've got a sense of what we can do. I guess part of my question is the extent to which you think that just the habit of office work, of working weeks, will pull us back. This actually will not be seen as much of fork in the road as it feels at the moment.
I do think there'll be more working from home, and there'll be more learning online. I think the way that leaders have established trust in their teams, so many executives I talked to said, oh, I could never trust my entire team to work remotely. Well, now they don't have a choice, and they're finding out it actually works when you trust people. I don't think that's going to shrink back. And the way they're all kind of showing up with, we need to dye our hair and we haven't quite gotten there yet, or we need a haircut, or a kid runs in, or the dog jumps on you, that there's no denying our 100% authentic selves are showing up at work. What Chris Shipley and I wrote the book, The Adaptation Advantage, we predicted a number of things that would take time to adapt. And we thought it would happen over the next 3, 5, 7 years. It's happening over 3, 5, 7 weeks.
Amazing. That's amazing. And before I want to come to hear points of view from lots of people on the call,
Sure.
But just one thing, Heather, what's the, in many ways, technology has enabled us for a long period of time. Mm-hmm. What do you think we are discovering about the limits of what technology can do? Right? And what do you think is needed if you're going to make this a fundamental part of the way in which work evolves now? What's technology failing for us at the moment?
Well, we've all seen technology fail in a number of ways, where we've put technology where we need a human and a human where we need a technology. Mm-hmm. And so the limits of that, I think we're going to start putting the human in the right place to leverage technology, as well as instead of the technology being this sort of hurdle that keeps you from the human. Like anytime you've called customer service and you got to push 3 and push 4 and push 6 and you can't get to a human. And if you ask a human is much better at determining intent than a binary system of voice commands. That's just a very simplistic example, just because we've all had it.
So, Heather, thank you. Just as I was reading some of the comments you were speaking, it's really quite striking how many people have pointed out, and rightly, that there's a risk you're talking about a very specific sector of the economy, and even within the economy, a very specific type of job. There are certain jobs where this is an option, where working from home is an option. I saw Daniel Steinberg pointed out quite how many in manufacturing sectors, for example, this is simply not available. And so, being alive to the fact that this is a revolution that is affecting probably a minority of people in work, or a significant minority of people in work is important. Can I just also pick up before I come to Sana? There's Nicolas Kleovoulou, if I can. I'd love to come to you, Nicolas, because you were saying, at least in the chat here, that your company, which as I see is in the pharma sector, R&D in the pharma sector, had already suggested moving to a world in which you were operating 4 days from home per week, if I've got that right. I don't know why you say you're regretting that now, but I'm really interested, because what I can't work out is what happens when we move to more of a mix. So will you tell us a little bit about what you're doing?
We did have a flexible working policy from the start, from when I started working at the company, which was you can do 2 days from home and 3 days at the office. But then part of the company, specifically the R&D department where I work, were piloting a 6-month working smart working policy that they wanted to roll out if it worked. So they already gave us the necessary equipment. They already gave us everything that we needed back in December last year. And the policy stated that unless you have face-to-face meetings that you need to attend, you don't need to come to the office. So we started doing, instead of 2 days from home, we started doing 4 days from home, which I think it's really good. It's a good concept, but not under these circumstances.
I appreciate that, Nicolas. Thank you. Listen, I am really struck by the sort of torrent of points that people are making about the extent to which working from home is a privilege, and it actually reminds me of a thinking we had probably not quite a year ago now, but that was led by my colleague, fellow editor Polly Curtis, where we talked about the weekend and the extent to which the weekend was going to be something that might end up being a privilege of a certain group of people within the workforce, but for whom so many people, the idea of the working week and the weekend was disappearing. So I think there's an important element to this, which, as with so much that's happening in this crisis, is not about the great leveler, but about the great magnifier of this pandemic. But can I come, Sana? This is totally unfair, but you know, we're physically distant, so why not? Sana's been a regular contributor to quite a lot of the work that we've done around artificial intelligence, happily not least because Sana Karagani is helping to lead the UK's Office of Artificial Intelligence. Sana, when you think about this, not so much as individually in terms of your experience of working from home and how it changes, but structurally from the point of governments and the extent to which we have technology systems that can sustain a fundamental change in the way in which we live and work so that we can do so effectively and securely. How do you professionally think about that problem?
So, I mean, I think we're in quite a good place in the UK in that, you know, a lot of thought has been put into putting in the right sets of infrastructure, making sure there's broadband available for people, putting in the investment in these things early on. Now, I mean, it's a piece of work that needs to continue. It's not finished yet, but it is definitely a piece of work that started pre this pandemic. And I think, just like the speaker previously, this is about you know, putting in the resilience in the economy and in society to allow this to work. Now, like I said, this doesn't mean that we can speak for everyone. Not everyone has access to computers, and not everyone has access to the digital kind of media that we all do and are sitting in front of right now, right? And one of the things that government is trying to do is to be much more, we have started and been working on digital inclusion, which is, you know, ensuring that everyone across the UK has access to digital equipment a lot more than they do now. So in, you know, previous to kind of this pandemic, it was around helping to alleviate things like loneliness, right? By giving people available, you know, the availability of these kinds of things, which is really an interesting thing, because right now we're looking at where we are and thinking this is the kind of embodiment of loneliness, right? Sitting in front of a computer, not being in front of all of you guys. But most people, when they're living remotely or you know, in the UK, they have loneliness is a part of their life, and technology was the connector, was a way to connect us. And now more and more, I think we're starting to see the fact that things have moved, you know, one of the ways that things haven't completely come to a grinding halt is because of the availability of technology that we all have in our lives. So not just for work to continue. And I totally agree with a lot of the things that people have been writing on the side about, not being measured, for example, on how long you work or FaceTime, but actually what you produce, and being able to gain the confidence of your boss that things actually do happen, by being at home and them not being able to watch you. So all of those things, is a transition, but also being able to see things that, see companies or people who have been less wanting to move forward on this digital evolution, to move down that curve much more, or up that curve rather, much more quickly. So one of the things for the Office for AI is about adoption of these technologies, and we think we have seen this period as a way for people to kind of jump that chasm much more quickly.
And Sana, what's your worry on the security front? We held a think-in last week on Zoom, right? And for everyone who's here on Zoom, and I appreciate right at the beginning there were lots of questions about which particular Zoom system we were working on. We're all trying to figure out how we navigate a platform where we can have a conversation that's as meaningful and open as possible, that's also as secure as possible. And I'm really struck by the extent to which there have been, if you like, individual privacy issues around the use of a platform like Zoom, but also you're increasingly seeing these big institutional corporate issues, right, where companies or parts of government are saying, look, they're not happy to work on these platforms. When you think about from the Office of AI's point of view and a broader government technology point of view, do you think there need to be these systems that can be sourced nationally so that they're secure, or are you confident that there is going to be a system of regulation for these platforms that mean that, essentially extremely sensitive and important services are provided by international network operators?
So that's a great question. I can't speak for the government when I respond to this, I'm afraid.
But no, don't.
You know that.
I do, but tell me what you think.
So what I think from my own personal kind of perspective on this is that allowing the market to regulate these things, like allowing kind of innovation to be part of the commercial market, means that you get better quality services at, in a more productive way. Whereas if you nationalize something, you're bringing it inside the house, you're limiting the number of people that can kind of further that thinking, etc., etc. So I'm definitely very much a person that thinks that having the market involved in this is very important. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't very important infrastructure and places where government needs to intervene, where there needs to be a kind of national control, where there needs to be rules and regulations that are adhered to, etc., etc. But I do think that some of these big platforms are very helpful, and in fact work very well together with government in a place like, for to draw one of my favorite kind of comparisons, the UK invites big tech in to talk to us, and we work alongside them to solve these solutions, to solve our big challenges. The US behaves very, very differently. It doesn't intervene, doesn't talk to big tech. It is very separate, kind of commercial, lives its own life, and government is its own. And sometimes they get along and sometimes they don't. But I think the way that the UK runs things is exactly right. I think this is going step by step, saying, "Oh, that's not very good. We don't like that. But how can we get over the next hurdle together?" Is really important, and showing that we care and we support when they have issues, right? Like, it is a lot of the things that we've been able to do, government has been able to do over the past little while, has been with the help of big tech. Right. Being able to put in the right infrastructure and the right allowances, being able to take content and misinformation down very quickly, which is a real problem right now for people being led down the wrong place.
Well, Chantal, let me pick up on a bunch of those points. There's a run. I'm going to come to Chris Duddridge, if I may, but just to warn you, because there's this world of really interesting conversations going along in the chat box alongside, and I really do want to try and come to Harmoon, who makes this point about us endlessly talking about recruitment and the people we bring onto companies and the way we work with them, but how do we change the culture of layoffs? I think that is a really big and interesting subject. Chris, I don't know whether or not you, as a sort of human embodiment of the internet itself, can check whether or not Albie Shale is right that post-depression we move to the 5-day week. Actually, I'm talking to Chris Cook here, Chris Duddridge. I'm not
feels a little bit
to do that.
like we're on a Sunday week.
The post-depression we move to the 5-day week, and whether or not as a result of this we'll move to a different shaped week as well. And I'm really struck by the points that Marlies and Nacho make, which are around the extent to which you monitor productivity. You know, are there mechanisms for allowing greater working from home, but monitoring productivity? But Chris Duddridge, can I come to you? You know, you work in the heart of this. You know, UiPath is someone that is an organization that for a good deal of time, you know, builds networks that improve productivity. What I wonder to myself is whether or not, one of the questions that Nacho asked is whether or not a world of more remote working is going to enable the employer to have the control over the productivity, the control over the employee inputs that they need. What do you make of the way in which culture changes when these networks take effect?
I think it's a really interesting topic, if I'm being honest with you. And there's lots of things in this entire talk that have kind of got my mind thinking about our perspective, whether it be, you know, moving to a task-based sort of role setup or not. But I think it all comes back to the data that ultimately you can collect from within an organization. Because, you know, to my mind, if you're thinking about, you know, the tasks that are performed by an individual role, and all of the different input that goes into running any organization across any different industry sector, it's not a very simple thing to break down. You know, actually, for many years, people have kind of done whatever's designed, whether it's a bad process or a happy path or actually just a process that is subject to re-engineering. But now we have the big tech inputs, we have the mining tools to essentially enable us to understand what is the best way to support the outcomes that we're looking to deliver within any organization. And to my mind, I think if you have good data about how an organization should best support its customers or the people it's dedicating its time to supporting or to supply or whatever it might be, then I think you can actually move to using humans in their most powerful form, which is exactly what I think Heather alluded to, which is the cognitive skills that they possess to make decisions, to ultimately kind of intervene where automation or AI actually just doesn't cut it. So to my mind, I think we can move to quite a dramatic change in terms of remote working, providing that the data is there.
And can I ask you? There's a great question which really cuts through all of this from Tamsin Dent. I might come to you, Tamsin, if you're happy to speak up. Which is to say, we're talking all about working from home because that's suddenly what we're doing. Do we really think that's the main focus of the future of work? So let's be honest. If we were having this conversation just 2 months ago, we would have probably been talking about automation and the redundancy of humans in the workplace. It wouldn't necessarily have been about working from home. What do you think, Chris? Do you think that we are overestimating the working from home revolution and that actually AI systems are going to have a much more profound effect on the workplace than around this specific area?
Yeah, I think we're dramatically overthinking it. And to be fair, most of the conversations are now having are post-COVID, you know, thinking about, you know, how do we recover and how do we support all of the organizations across every different industry sector that is going to essentially, some of them have dams in their way at the moment, which ultimately will be opened and they'll have to service the backlog as fast as they had the active work that they were supporting. So I think overthinking it is definitely what we're doing. I remember, you know, we often have to think as an automation vendor, we're on the fringes of talking about, you know, whether it's a net job creator or actually whether automation will decimate certain industry sectors. And frankly, I think this COVID pandemic has actually created a little bit of a distraction, because ultimately for us, I think there are some industry sectors where technology, AI, automation, whatever it may be, will ultimately transform those roles of what they were. They may not exist beyond not just COVID, but longer term, because of the advancements in technology. So yeah, I think ultimately, I think we're overthinking it, because I think for me the most important thing is for any person in the world who is employed, who has a role that might be affected dramatically by this COVID crisis, we have a lot of options available to us, that are reskilling, that are looking to kind of innovate within our own organizations. But ultimately, I think most organizations' objective at the moment is their customers and their staff, beyond a lot of other different things.
Can I pick up, Chris? Thank you so much. I'm going to come back to you in a bit, if I may. But I wanted to ask: is Dumisani there? There's someone called, I think, Dumisani Dube, who's got a South African business, and I wonder whether or not I could come to you, because I'm really interested in this question of how you organise a business and make sure that in a more networked world, you feel as though you have, an employer feels as though they have sufficient oversight of the productivity there. I don't know. They may have left. I particularly enjoyed. Dumisani, are you there?
Yes, I'm there.
Oh, hello.
Sorry, I'm in a dim room.
So don't worry. There's some production values that we're all struggling with here. I also look as though I'm somewhere a little bit gloomy. But Dumisani, tell us a little bit, because it sounds as though, at least from the comment you posted, that you're dealing with this question of how people work remotely, and it's not altogether easy.
Yes. So about a year ago, our organization, we're a not-for-profit organization, primarily funded by DFID, actually, and we focus on making financial markets work for the poor. And when we started the work from home arrangement, this was 2 days at home and 3 days in the office. We sort of like, with management, we're now thinking to say, how do you best measure improved employee productivity with that introduction? And I think this has really brought in a bit of complexity, and we've been trying to crack our heads around it. And we really haven't yet figured it out to say, does work from home actually improve productivity? Yes, it might bring a sense of people being more free working from home, but does it translate to improve productivity? So that's the biggest question we're grappling with, and I'm sure I'm also keen to hear some thoughts around that.
Thank you. Thank you. Can I also, if Hamoon is there, can I ask you, Hamoon, just to make the point, you made a point about layoffs, and it's such an unfashionable one to make, to say, how do we improve the culture of layoffs? But you're right, a lot of this is how we make these changes well. What have you got in mind? Well, I can't hear you for a sec. Hamoon, sorry, I can't hear you. Maybe I'm alone? No, that doesn't. No, that's not. I think you're unmuted, but it may just be the mic. No, you're muted again. Are we getting anywhere?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. We thought it was one of those awkward
Okay,
things.
sorry about that.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, so I appreciate that, and it's been great to join the conversation. I think a lot of our work has been over the last month and a half with large organizations and CHROs, and I think what becomes clear is publicly there's a lot of talk immediately around how do we focus on supporting employees, but even the CHROs of the most progressive companies that are saying no layoffs for the next 3, 6, or 9 months are looking on the other side of that and seeing that at some point they're going to need to make workforce transitions. And so what I've been most concerned about is how people who will be laid off will be left behind and left alone in that transition. No matter which cut we take on the question of future of work, the one timeless thing we can count on is the number, intensity, and frequency of transitions are only going to multiply over the coming years. Yeah. And our systems are simply not set up to support people through transitions effectively. And so maybe just 2 quick points on that. One is some organizations are starting to shift from we lay you off, goodbye, we're never going to deal with you, so we don't care what your experience is, to you are at some point going to be a future talent, future customer, future ambassador. So we're actually going to turn into an outskilling experience where we're investing in landing you in what your next opportunity is, even if that's not with us. And where you don't have companies acting that way, I think the broader society, all of us together, need to ask the question of how do we support people who are laid off? There's a stat that says for every percentage rise in unemployment in the US, you have something like 10,000 additional deaths, whether it's by suicide, mental health, and other reasons. And so COVID kills, so does layoffs. And what does it look like for us to create a system where it's not so stigmatized to be the laid off person, and you're actually effectively supported through that transition, perhaps using AI to facilitate that support?
Okay, I think that's a really good point. Chantal, can I go back to you, Chantal Free? The reason I think the point that Hamel's making leads sort of inevitably from the point that you made at the outset, which is if we think of ourselves less having jobs but a set of skills, that implies not only a set of individual responsibilities, but responsibilities of our employer, our education system, our government in enabling us to continue to develop and grow those skills. And so when you stand back from this, whether you're talking about a working from home revolution, you know, spawned by COVID-19, or whether you're actually talking about AI, automation and displacement in the workforce, what do you think, or where do you think the responsibility lies in individuals' development of skills over the course of their working life?
That's a very good question, actually. And we've done a really good piece of research around 6 months ago to try to answer that question. And clearly it's not simple, but I think where we landed was that it really does require a concerted effort by organizations, by individuals, by governments, by charities, and by various other parts of society to really deal with that issue. I mean, that conversation around, you know, are we overrating the fact that we're just working from home now? I actually think that I don't think we are overrating. I do think that this is not just about working from home. There's so many other things that have happened as a result of this massive shift to us working from home. So I do think that, yes, I mean, things are not going to remain as they are now, but I don't believe they're going to go back to where we started. And I do think that there is going to be an acceleration of that image we had around the future of work, because with this working from home has created, as it was discussed earlier, a huge new adoption of remote working technologies. It has talked to us around, you know, the flexibility of where and when people do work, right? That was a concept that were being trialed around the future of work. It did push us to utilize people in different ways. If the way that the job, to call it that way, they were doing doesn't exist anymore, we're using those skills in getting something new that needs to be done during that crisis. We learned about remote management. We're doing a lot more e-learning. Organizations' whole governance and operating models are changing as part of that. So I do think that whatever we're doing is not just about working from home and going back to the office, but some of it will stay, which means that that future of work around some jobs disappearing, understanding skills, etc., is there. And it's a huge problem potentially. And based on our research, it's a collective effort that needs to be put in place, you know, in a very concerted way for society to overcome it.
I mean, the reason why it's such a big issue, and the reason why I think it will cause such concern is we're talking about some very fundamental changes in our understanding of our relationship between employer and employee that's happening now. One of the questions that's here has been the extent to which, if we are working from home, for example, the costs of running, in effect, the office now sit with the employee rather than with the employer. And I imagine that, you know, you work in a very large company. There are very large companies we know already reconsidering whether they need to have a big office at all, or a big office in the centre of a city. These things are gonna change. What do you think that the combination of technology and this crisis is going to mark another milestone in the way in which we've moved away from, if you like, a lifelong relationship with our employer to something that is much more fluid, and where the burden of investment and cost sits with the individual?
I think the model will be more fluid, but also there's going to be probably a bigger acceptance from society, from individuals, etc., that fluid is okay. So I think we are quite preoccupied at the moment. And of course I understand, because there's a stability element that comes with it, but we are quite preoccupied around being employed and being an employee. And maybe if the work is going to be done by a wider ecosystem, where only main relationship is not around employee-employer, we're going to look at some of these concepts differently.
Right. Chantal, thank you very much. Hester McCreary has skills because she can operate her blue digital hand. Hester, are you there? Can we hear you?
Hello. Hopefully you can hear me. Yeah?
You can hear you loud and clear.
Hey. Okay. Hi. Thanks. Sorry. The point I wanted to make goes back a little bit, I think, to when we were talking about assessing productivity of employees working remotely. And I guess it's one I just wanted to exercise a bit of caution on, because I did a research piece last year I was freelancing for a couple about to launch a business for which their employees would be working remotely, and they wanted me to find out how we could track how productive their remote workers were, because they had remote workers in the Philippines and in all different parts of the world. And there are loads of online platform tools you can buy and access to get your remote workers to log on to, and you can track, you know, data and statistics of what they're doing. But it becomes like a little bit of a spooky sort of point to make when we live in a society obsessed with sort of growth, that how productive employees might be working remotely shouldn't just come down to the number of clicks they've made, the number of times of hours they've been on sites or emails they've sent. It should come back to employees and managers having specified job descriptions and roles and targets or things for these people to hit. Productivity should be looked at in, whilst working remotely, what a person's, not just how much physically output a person's done, but how much a person working remotely has achieved and where that ties in to what they were asked to do. So I guess it comes back to businesses being a bit more conscious about, before they just start employing people to try and do loads and loads and loads, slowing down and thinking, what are we actually asking our employees to do? And what's a sensible way of tracking how much productivity or progress they're going to make whilst working remotely? Let's not just track how many emails they've sent or how many times they've clicked certain sites, because there's loads of online tools that can track that. And I think that will give remote employers a sort of false sense of how productive people are working remote.
I mean, God, we could have a conversation just about that, because you can piece apart, can't you, the creepiness of being tracked in terms of your online activity. Then you can have a conversation which is about productivity itself and what we're measuring and whether we're measuring the actual performance of the individual. And then there's this broader debate which is inevitably going to reoccur, which is about growth in the context of a colossal recession, but potentially a reset about what matters in the way we live our lives. So Hester, I think there's a whole world there, and I must suggest we come back to it because time is running out. So I wanted to come back, if I could, just to Heather McGowan. I don't know whether Heather's there. Heather, are you still with us?
Yep.
But Heather, can I just wanted to sort of, if you like, sort of be the skeptic about all of this and about the advantages of adaptation. Quite a lot of the conversation here is about, in the chat, in the column, if you've been following it, is actually about the extent to which these changes are for a very privileged few, and that they actually exacerbate, you know, divisions and differences in our society. Some of the concerns that have been raised are about the extent to which they seem to advantage employees, but very quickly we'll discover actually that the costs and burdens are shouldered by the by the employees, and the employers benefit more than the employees. How much do you worry that the changes that are being advocated here are a false promise to the individual?
Well, I think I would even zoom up a little bit from that and get a little bit more macro. I think I mentioned this on our call last week. I feel like this is the third existential challenge of our lifetimes.
Yeah.
First, climate change, the second was income inequality, and now this global pandemic. And sort of the good news in this global pandemic is the first time we're putting people before profit. We're putting our healthcare system, we're putting our most vulnerable, we're putting those with underlying health conditions before our economy. And I do understand that you can't decouple the economy from our society, because as someone on the call pointed out, or it was in the chat box, every 1% we go up in unemployment, there's a traceable increase in suicide and homicide and domestic violence and a number of factors. So you can't really decouple them. But one of the things I see happening, and it's a piece I'm working on right now for Forbes later this week, is that these three existential threats are coming together. So it's laying bare how poor our social safety net is for the most vulnerable. You know, we couldn't imagine in the US paying $15 an hour for our essential workers who are keeping us all home safe right now. But suddenly they're getting $17 an hour in some places. We couldn't afford in the US again, sick pay for people who are hourly workers who are keeping us going. And now suddenly that other people having sick pay is in our best interest. I don't want my Uber driver to have coronavirus. I want that my Uber driver to be home and be safe. Now I'm willing to pay for that. And I think there's a shift that's taking place. And I don't know if it's going to stick through the virus, but right now I feel like there's a shift taking place where we're suddenly realizing that your education and your health is important to my education and my health. And we're inextricably linked in a way that we needed this kind of virus to realize. And so suddenly the health and the welfare, and there's been tremendous research on this, that, you know, investments in education end up in GDP growth, you know, that we're ignoring. So the income inequality can't get any more disparate and still be good for you, even if you're at the most selfish level. But I think there's something going on with this virus where we're starting to understand each other in a different way. So whether the employer, you know, privileges the people who can work from home, and it's a double-edged sword because you're really working around the clock and they're monitoring you. Yeah, we can look at that kind of stuff, but I think there's a bigger shift taking place that we should all be talking about, and we should be demanding, frankly, that, you know, Margaret Mead was asked, a cultural anthropologist, what was the first symbol of civilization? You know, was it religious symbols or cultural tools or hunting tools or whatever there was? And she said the first symbol of a civilization was a healed femur bone. Because if you break your femur bone, you can't do anything. And the only way your femur bone is going to heal is if somebody else takes care of you, if somebody else does the hunting and the fishing and the gathering so that you can heal. This is our healed femur bone moment where we can take our civilization to the next level. All these technology tools we have unleash the potential of humanity. In the last lifetime, we've taken more people out of global poverty, increased global literacy. In the short period of time, we've connected more people to the internet. If we can do that in one lifespan, you know, 60, 70 years versus 5,000 years of recorded history, this virus is no match for us, but we have to have the right perspective. So the questions about sort of like, you know, is my employer watching me? I think we should be demanding more as a civilization. So sorry, I'll step off my soapbox now.
No, that's good. No, that's great. You should see that people are digitally cheering. Chris Duddridge, I wanted to come back to you just as we come towards the close here. You talked about data. The one thing we've not touched upon is sort of privacy concerns in this world. How do you handle those?
In what way, James?
Not within UiPath, but more broadly, if you are going to move to a world where you're going to be operating your office, your business on a much more networked basis, what if you like, are the guidelines, the sort of values by which you think a business can operate that makes the most of data but respects privacy and individual rights?
Yeah, thanks for clarifying. I think there's two interesting things that were raised today. I mean, I think someone raised a comment around the US being far more sort of locked down in terms of innovating where data or technology is concerned, and the UK being a bit more open to having a two-way door, try it, and if it doesn't work, they can reverse that process. But I think there's somewhere in between that looks ultimately at the safety of data now that it's on everyone's radar as much as it is. The US has always had the Patriots Act as a good example, in terms of kind of data access, and the UK has been far more kind of open to evaluating different standards. I think it just comes down to the standards by which we operate. Every organization, whether it be government, private sector, organizations that handle that data, we're under the most strenuous data privacy laws that have ever existed, under things like GDPR and all of the other data privacy laws that exist, but they have to be upheld. They have to be actually thought about before a piece of technology is launched. Actually, whilst people used to flaunt badges of their kind of their security credentials, and that used to be just the tick box that you'd get to say we could deploy this enterprise wide, there's actually now a far deeper conversation around the standards of how those organizations operate and those ethical standards. And actually some of the good things that have happened in the past with some of the data privacy breaches that have forced a couple of the big tech companies to come clean on how they were using data, I think has just transformed the organization, every organization, to think it's really important, and people are not going to let these things slide. So I think
That's
it might be a bit of a roundabout answer, but
no, that's really helpful. I realise that we've come to the end of our time. It's 7:30. If you've not been to a ThinkIn before, then I should let you know it's basically modelled on a news meeting, an editorial conference. At the end of it, the editor, me or one of my fellow editors, tries to pull together not a summary of the conversation, but if you like, a couple of the key thoughts that we take away, a point of view informed by what we've heard. I'd stand back and point to two things in particular. Clearly, a large amount of the conversation, and a good deal of it, is actually just really interesting in terms of the culture of working, the way Lucia talked right at the beginning about the impact on how we talk to each other, the boundaries that we do or don't have, the way in which we are possibly better known by working in the way that we currently are, but it clearly a very mixed picture. There's also the world that Hester described, that some of the issues that Dumisani described, which are about the oversight, the sort of surveillance that may come with this. And there have been a lot of discussions about the extent to which we emphasize productivity without having fully thought about the human connections we're looking for in work and the way in which all of that works. The point that Heather made at the end there about putting people before profit. But journalistically, I'd have to say I come away with sort of two thoughts that we should probably investigate further. One is, forgive me, a rather big and blanket thought, which is that there is a real risk that in looking at this particular issue, we are missing the much bigger one, and that is that working from home, as the chat has emphasised, affects a very narrow group of people in our economy. And what we are seeing, in effect, is actually another fragmenting of the way in which the world of work and workers breaks apart. That this is a fracture in the labour market in the way in which we have had for some time industrial versus service workers, or we've had self-employed versus employed, or we've had increasingly long-term employed in the gig economy. We may find that the world of working from home and the world of those who can't actually splits further and further apart. And one of the consequences of that, and I was struck by the point about training, is it will be harder to move from one kind of job to the other. And I think that's something that is a big thing to think about, and something to consider that goes beyond tech but is an issue of public policy. And then I think I do come back to the point right at the beginning that Chantal made, which is about thinking about ourselves individually as in terms of skills rather than jobs, again, I think that you're left there with a realization that the combination of this crisis and technology is going to change the way in which employers think about us as employees and the ways and the places of work. The responsibility must be shared between the individual, the company, and the government for how we make sure that we keep developing and improving our skills through our working lives. These are two, it seems to me, very, very significant changes that come from this that are not in answering to the pandemic, but are answering to the changes in our working lives as a result of it. So I hope that we have touched on many of the issues around the future of work, the future of skills. I appreciate too that we've not probably answered the question, what is the future of work? But we've certainly, I hope, done a fair bit of colouring in and given a sense of the way it's going to change. Please do come to many of our coming think-ins. The whole purpose of this is exactly what's happened in the last hour. A system of organised listening, trying to inform and understand the world we're living in. If you're not a member of Tortoise, I should say, we've opened up Tortoise. You can just sign up, you can get a free trial, join us for a month and see what it's like. We'd really love to have you as a member. If you want to keep track, I hope in a calm and concise way of what's happening day by day in the news, Claudia Williams and Giles Wattell, my colleagues, put out a daily email called The Sense Maker, which does, I think, give you a real grip on what's happening. My great colleague, Chris Cook, wrote it today. Chris, thank you for hosting the chat. And so just my final word of thanks is actually to the great gang of people who joined us this evening, to Chris Duddridge, to Sana Karigani, to Heather McGowan, and to Chantal Free. Thank you to all of you. Thank you to Capita for being our partner in this endeavour. And one final plug. Thank you to my colleague Alexandra Musavizadeh, who's been the person who's been the driving force behind requiring us to think more deeply about the transformative effect of artificial intelligence on the way we live and work. Thank you all for joining us. As you know, if you've been to a digital think-in, there's no applause, there's just happy waving. Please wave happily, we can see you. Yes, great. I don't know where this double-handed wave come from. I don't think it's going to take off, but there you are. Have a great evening, everyone. Thanks so much.